Welcome to Channel 17, the Town of Colonie Government Channel.
This interview is with David Golden of C Company 714th Tank Battalion. He is currently the unit rep for that battalion with the 12th Armored Division Association. He resides in Latham, New York. This interview is taking place in Abilene, Texas on October the 5th, 1996 at the Embassy Suites Hotel, site of the Southwest Chapter reunion taking place during the time frame of October the 3rd, 4th, and 5th of 1996. David, if you would, tell me a little bit about who your parents were and where you grew up and the kind of setting your childhood took place in.
Okay, I was born in Albany, New York, of course, which is the capital of New York State, on December 24th, 1923. At that time, my mom, Marie Golden, and my father, Harry Golden, at that time had 4 children. They had 1 son and 4 daughters, and I, of course, became the 6th child. Eventually, they had 3 more sons, so they ended up with 9 children, 5 boys and 4 girls. I grew up in Albany, New York. I went to public schools in Albany, New York, and started high school there. But in 1940, my dad bought a farm out in what was the town of Colonie, about 10 miles north of Albany, New York, and we moved to the farm, and we kind of considered ourselves farmers, something my dad always wanted to be. So I changed high schools, and I went to Watervliet High School in Watervliet, New York, which is the home of the Watervliet Arsenal, where they made all the big guns for World War II. Anyway, it came along, I finished high school, and I started working in a warehouse, a cold storage warehouse, and I can remember very well an evening in December of 1941. We went to a movie in Albany at the Grand Theater, and when we came out of the Grand Theater that night, I think it must have been around 10 o'clock at night, the newspaper hawks were out there shouting, "Extra, extra, Pearl Harbor bombed." And that's the night that Pearl Harbor was bombed. I remember myself saying, and of course we were aware at that time that much of the world was already at war with Germany and Japan, and most of us, I guess, were sided with Great Britain and the European countries who were fighting Hitler. And so I made the expression, I said, oh good, now we'll beat them. But of course at that time we didn't know how bad we'd been hurt at Pearl Harbor. And it took a little time for it all to sink in. At that time I was 17 years old, and pretty near 18. And so things went on. I finished school and I went to work, and come around, in the meantime, a couple of my sisters who were married, their husbands were drafted and went into the service. And one by one I saw these men who were only 3 or 4 years older than I was going into the service, and some of them had children. So come around October 1942, I decided I would enlist. At that time, the draft was only taking men 20 years and older. So I went down, I volunteered for the Army, and they said, what do you want to do? Well, I loved driving a tractor on the farm, so I said, well, one of the best things I could be doing, maybe drive a tank. And so I did. I asked, because I was voluntary enlistment, we were given a choice of what branch of the service we wanted to go into. And I asked, I want to go into a tank outfit. I didn't know that was the Armored Force at that time, but as it turned out, I left Albany, New York, and I went to Fort Dix, New Jersey for induction. And we were there probably 3 or 4 days, and they put us all on a train and didn't tell us exactly where we were going. And sure enough, I think in a day or so, we ended up at Camp Campbell, Kentucky. I remember on the train an officer who I believe was probably a lieutenant colonel or something, I didn't know at that time, came to me and he said, "Are you really in the Army?" Because at 18 years old, I could have passed for 12 or 13. I think I never had shaved. I was rather young looking. But I said, "Yes, I'm in the Army." So they took us to the big field house where they did what everyone else come in. They were just starting. The 12th Armored Division was, a little over a month old at that time and wasn't even up to 50% strength yet. So they took us to a field house and they kind of qualified us for what branch of what jobs we should be selected for. I didn't know that an armored division was made up of armored regiments and armored field artillery regiments and so on. But as it turned out, I got my wish. I was assigned to a tank company, I Company of the 44th Armored Regiment. And so we started basic training. We learned how to right face and left face and about face. We got map reading. And I got to pat myself on the back a little. I was only a kid. But most of the other men in my company who were 2, 3, 4, 5 years older than me, one man was 12 years older, Fred Sheldon, and we called him Pappy. We came to be that. We called him Pappy. But a lot of them wanted to sit around me because I seemed to get 100% on all the map reading tests and all the different things. I did well. And I loved it. I really enjoyed the discipline and the fact that we were learning to maybe fight for our country. But a time came when they called me into the orderly room one day. Basic training wasn't quite over yet. It was in December. We'd only been in the Army a little less than, a little more than 2 months. And they asked me if I would like to go to the Armored Force School at Fort Knox, Kentucky, to learn to be a tank mechanic. Well, I'm not sure that I really wanted to be a tank mechanic, but I didn't want to pass up an opportunity for additional education, so I said yes. So I left Camp Campbell. Everyone else who had come in when I did, other than the cadre, were all buck privates. And as I was, but they told me I had to be a PFC to go to Armored Force School. So here I was, the first one in the company to get a promotion, 1 stripe. And I no sooner arrived at Fort Knox than we were informed that in order to go to this school, you had to be a technician 5th grade, which meant here I was, not 3 months a soldier, and all of a sudden I was a technician 5th grade. We spent 3 months going to the school, and I learned all about the bogey wheels and the suspension systems and how to take an engine out of a tank and out in the field, cut a log off a tree and wedge it in the turret and take a block and fall and pull an engine out and put it back in something like 2 hours. And we learned to drive the M3, the Sherman tanks, or the M4s. And so I finished my schooling. Here I was at T5, and I went back to Camp Campbell. Well, we find out we get back to Camp Campbell, and in a tank company which consisted of 109 men, there were 3 tank platoons and a headquarters platoon, and every tank commander was a sergeant, and the gunners were corporals, and most everybody had at least 2 stripes, which was what I had with a T under it. But so I go back and I find out that men that had been privates when I left, one of them was already first sergeant. Others were sergeants. So anyway, we had the company, most of the grades in the company were taken. So I was at T5 and I was assigned to the motor pool. I worked on tanks for a while, but I wanted to be a tank crewman. So eventually I did. I got transferred from the motor pool to a tank as a gunner, and I got changed from a technician 5th grade to a corporal. As time went on, we learned our map reading, and we went out on night problems, night map reading courses, and we were pretty well trained by August of 1943, and then we went on Tennessee maneuvers. And this was quite an experience. We all through central Tennessee, I remember some of the towns like McMinnville and Carthage and different towns that we maneuvered around. And we spent, I think, from the beginning of September till sometime in November on Tennessee maneuvers. Then they reorganized the 12th Armored Division, as they did all other armored divisions. They triangularized them. And in other words, they did away with the armored regiments, and they made tank battalions out of them. And they made the artillery battalions smaller. Anyway, each armored division then had 3 tank battalions, 3 field artillery battalions, and 3 armored infantry battalions. So this meant they ended up with an extra tank battalion, and that extra one happened to be the 714th, the one where we became, from being I Company of the 44th Armored Regiment, we became C Company of the 714th Tank Battalion. And we got a new company commander assigned to us. And we, instead of going to Camp Barkley as the rest of the 12th Armored Division did, we, the 714th, went to Fort Jackson, South Carolina. And in Fort Jackson, we were there a short while and they sent us out on maneuvers, and we tore up so much farmland in South Carolina with our tanks that they grounded us. They told us no more maneuvering of these tanks while you're here. So all we did was we watched guard duty for weeks on. Where you normally walk guard duty 2 on and 4 off, we changed it to 4 on and 8 off because it was such a long stretch of guard duty. And once again, as time went on, some changes were made at the 12th Armored Division in Camp Barkley, Texas, and the 44th Tank Battalion was ordered to the Pacific. So the way I understand it, and this might not be 100% accurate, but I understand that General Carlos Brewer, who was commanding general, said, as long as I got to get replace the 44th Tank Battalion, why don't I bring my own 714th back? And they did, and we moved to Camp Barkley, Texas. We lived in the little Quonset huts, which I tell my wife, and I write in my column in the Hellcat News that they were our condominiums out there. They were, if I remember right, we slept about not more than 12 or 16 men in one of those little huts, and which would mean that we must have had 6 or 8 of them for the company. And our latrines were in a separate building. We'd have to walk, sometimes 100 yards maybe over to the latrine to take a shower or shave or whatever. But it was, I enjoyed it. I wasn't one of those people that I only got into Abilene twice all the time. I was at Camp Barkley because, for one thing, most of my money went home every month because my family had need for it. And so we trained at Camp Barkley. I did get a furlough out of Barkley, and I did get home to New York State. And I remember riding the train from Dallas to Chicago and never having a seat. There were no seats to be had on the train. And so we just throw our duffel bag in the space between 2 railroad cars and sat on it for, it must have been 18, 20 hours up to Dallas then, as I remember it. But anyway, I got home, and I remember riding the bus from Schenectady, New York, down to Latham, and I had my 12th Armored patch on, which I was real proud of. And I heard these 2 men talking behind me saying, you said we got 12 armored divisions now? They must have known that was an armored division patch. And I kind of felt good about that. And I got home. I believe I had 8 or 10 days home and finished my furlough. Went back to Camp Barkley, and still a corporal, still a gunner in the company commander's tank. And then we, eventually, we left Camp Barkley for Camp Shanks, as the rest of the division did. Traveled by train. We took the southern route over through Mississippi, I think, in Louisiana, Mississippi, up through the Carolinas to Camp Shanks, New York. And once again, I got a chance because we were at Shanks, and that was only about, 100 miles from where I lived. My company commander, whose tank, by this time, Charles C. Clayton was our company commander, a young man just 4 days, less than a year older than I was. So I was, at that time, must have been I must have been in my 20s. He couldn't have been quite 22 yet, but he was our company commander. And he said, why don't you take a few hours and go home? So I did. I got an opportunity to, I grabbed a train, the old Delaware and Hudson Railroad, which is no longer there, and I rode 90 miles up to Albany, and then I was lucky to get a ride out to Latham, which is 10 miles farther on, and I walked the last mile home, and my sister Harriet came to the door and welcomed me. And well, I had about 6 hours I spent there, and then I had to go back. I got a ride back into Albany, got the D&H, which was the Delaware and Hudson Railroad, back down the Hudson River, the west side of the Hudson River, to West Point, actually, where Camp Shanks is adjacent to West Point, and I was back at camp. It was just a few days after that, we got a ride, I guess, by train, if I remember right. I think we went by train down to New York to the port of embarkation, and we loaded on to the U.S. Marine Raven, a Liberty ship, small ship, and we'd had to go on, give your name, David E. Golden, 121-71694, and on you'd go, and we loaded on. We slept in the holds of these transport ships 5 high, and I had the top bunk. And believe me, you'd sweat and you could smell your perspiration. But anyway, it was quite a trip to England. Right, we'd get submarine watch up in the bow of the ship. We'd be watching for submarines, and of course, the first time you did it, you got pretty seasick. And once you relieved yourself of everything you had in your stomach, well, then you got over it, and it wasn't too bad after that. But I remember the night I looked and I saw some land ahead, and I said, "What is that?" And one of the sailors said, "That's Land's End." And Land's End is this, let's see, the southwesternmost part of the British Isle. And that was the first I saw of England. Well, we landed, where I know a lot of the division went to Liverpool, we landed in Southampton. And from Southampton, they took us by train up to, I'm not sure what the name of the place was, but it was an old airfield where there were a lot of Quonset huts. And we spent I think two nights in the Quonset huts there. And then we moved to Tidworth Barracks, an old Army installation, British Army installation near Andover in England. And we had these huge, big brick buildings. And they were, you could tell that they had probably been used by the British Army since going to India and places like that, you know. And there was a lot of nostalgia about that. Well, we got our new tanks, our new equipment. And I remember we did sneak into the kitchen at night, and we'd sneak out some canned milk and canned peaches and things and stow them in our tanks so we'd have something when we got into France. But anyway, the members of my crew at that time were Charlie Clayton, our company commander, Julian Head was our driver, and Julian had already served with the British 8th Army in North Africa. He went over there with General Patton as an observer a couple of years before, and actually used the old M3 tanks with the 75 down on the Sponson, fighting the British, the Rommel's troops down there. So he had some wartime experience ahead of the rest of us. Jerry Theobald was our assistant driver or bow gunner, and a man named John Kist was our assistant gunner, and he was a staff sergeant. And the reason he was our assistant gunner was because he was our radio sergeant, our communications sergeant, and they wanted him in the company commander's tank. So he was actually my assistant, although he was a staff sergeant. So we went to France, and we landed on the French coast, and on an LST. And these LSTs are like a cork floating on the water. You could they bounced around, and some of our tanks actually, they were chained down the hole, but some of them did break loose, and some men had to volunteer to go down there and try and secure them. And they, no one that I know of got hurt, but it was quite a dangerous job. We landed in France, unloaded our tanks, and you could see other ships that had been hit mines or something in the past, because this was in September, which would be what, June, July, 90 days after D-Day. And we went near a little town called Ophé in France, and we bivouacked outside of an old French farm, and we actually slept in the haymows. Had a haymow at the barn, and I remember the French kids coming out there and looking at us, and I don't know whether they were looking at us and saying, "Look at these heroes coming to save us," or what, but they were really peasants. I mean, and I don't say that disrespectfully. They were farm kids, and they didn't look like they had an awful lot, you know. And my heart went out to them. But anyway, we had Thanksgiving dinner there in this spot, and that was in November. And it wasn't on Thanksgiving. It was a day or two later or before, but it wasn't exactly on Thanksgiving. So anyway, we went into convoy, and we moved up toward the front, past Paris. At this time, of course, Paris had already been taken and liberated, I guess you would say. And we got up near the Maginot Line. And one of our first objectives was a town called Bettweiler.
You mentioned a few things I wanted to, just somewhere on the tape, get clarification. You were just mentioning the crew, and I'd like you to tell me a little bit about how a tank crew works. In other words, you've given us some names, some titles, sort of sit inside the tank mentally. Mm-hmm. and sort of describe what a gunner does and what the assistant driver and so on.
Fine. All right. Normally, a medium tank crew, with a Sherman is a medium tank, would consist of 5 men. You have a driver who is primarily responsible for driving the tank, actually sitting in the driver's seat, driving the tank. You have a bow gunner who sits across the transmission. In the center of the tank is the transmission. On the other side of the transmission, the bow gunner sits, or assistant driver. He's been called both titles, but his actual title, the last toward the end, was bow gunner. The reason he was called a bow gunner because he had a .30 caliber machine gun mounted right in front of him that he could look through his periscope and fire this .30 caliber machine gun, aiming it mostly by the tracer bullets that would come out of it, because you could see the tracer going out and you could see where you were hitting. Then up in the turret, you had the gunner who sat in the gunner's seat on the right-hand side of the turret, and it was his responsibility, of course, to take fire commands from the tank commander and get his sights on any designated target and fire when the command was given. On the other side of the breech of the gun, in our case, when we started out, we had 75s, but then once we lost our first tank, we got a new tank, and it had a 76 on it, which was quite an improvement over the 70, more than 1 millimeter would suggest. But the assistant gunner's job was to load the main gun, the 75, and also near him there was a .30 caliber machine gun loaded coaxially with the 75, which meant that it was parallel with the 75 and could be fired from the same sights. But once again, the gunner would also adjust it when using the .30 caliber, would adjust by use of the tracer that was going out. And then of course the tank commander was up in the turret, and he also had a .50 caliber machine gun mounted on the top on the turret, which he could fire. And our sidearms at that time were what we called grease guns. They were a sort of a submachine gun. I understand they cost about $8 to make them. They were just like sheet metal made out of, and they fired the same bullet, the .45 caliber bullet that the Thompson submachine gun fired. But they held clips. The clips that we had held 30 rounds of ammunition. But you could get clips from bigger clips, but we never had them. Basically, that's what the duties of the tank. But the main thing was with a tank crew, you almost all had to know each other's jobs to some extent, because you never knew when you were going to lose a driver or lose a bow gunner or and primarily lose a tank commander, because tank commanders were somewhat exposed when the rest of us were buttoned up, and you could lose tank commanders quite regularly. So. And in our case, when the company commander wasn't in the tank, I would set up in his place and be, in effect, the tank commander. And one of the differences with our tank and the other tanks in our company was that being a command tank, we would have a double radio set. We would have one radio set where we communicated with the people in our own company, the different platoons, and then another one on a different band where we would contact our task force commander or the battalion commander or higher echelon. So you had to always be somebody on that radio to receive incoming messages or warnings or whatever.
Well, so, was that because you were the command tank and you had the staff sergeant that had to sort of double up?
Yeah.
Did the command tank, were they at a disadvantage when you got into operations?
Well, I never found it that way, because most of the time when we were in actual combat, Captain Clayton was with us. We'd have a 5-man crew. We did have a disadvantage, though, and I don't like too much to mention this, but we did, after Herlisheim, have to do away with our staff sergeant, because he refused to load the gun. He just broke down. He told Captain Clayton, of course, we lost our tank coming out of there anyway, but when we got a next tank the next day, we got a new man. Jim Bagley came in with us. He was the assistant communication sergeant, and he took this other man's place. And then we were great. We had a good tank crew. We never had any major problems. The biggest disadvantage of having a company commander in your tank was that any time we laid down for the night, we went into a support area at night. We'd only have 4 men to stand guard instead of 5, because the company commander would be at meetings and he wasn't. So we never for 5 months. While we were in combat, anytime we were in combat, well, I don't ever remember sleeping more than 2 hours at a time. And most of the time it was we'd go one on and one off. 1 man in the turret and 1 man out on the ground about 10, 15 feet in front of the tank, just to detect if anybody was approaching. So that was, the other tanks would have 5 men, so they'd have a little more people to share that responsibility. But I was always glad to be in a company commander's tank because I was there to know what was going on all the time, you know, and receive the phone. And they used to call him Junior because he was a young man, and he looked young. He was very young looking too, and so they'd call Junior, and if he wasn't there, I'd answer, and I'm sure that everybody in the battalion knew my voice by the time we'd been in combat a couple of months, and I don't feel any disadvantage for that, no. But anyway, can I get back?
Yes.
The first night when we hit Bettville, they wanted to send a platoon, reconnaissance squad out into this town, Bettweiler, to determine, you know, what the situation was there. And I went with I'm going to say Charlie Clayton because he's passed away now, but I feel pretty close to him. And I went into a big old, one of the big pillboxes on the Maginot Line, and the concrete must have been 4 feet thick. And you went in there, and that's where we held the meeting, getting this infantry squad ready to go down across this canal or river or whatever was down there into Bettweiler and see what the situation was. And I'll tell you, my heart went with them because, you know, this was their first combat patrol. And after all the training we had, I'm sure that it was, they had their concerns. But they did. They went out on patrol and they came back with one German prisoner. They had a young lad, I don't think he was more than 17 or 18 years old. And apparently he was either AWOL from his unit or a deserted or something because he wasn't with his unit. But they brought him back and then they sent him back. Just, I don't know what information they ever got from him. But eventually the next morning we went around through around this river or stream that was there into Bettweiler, and the town was deserted. So we set up our perimeter all around the town, and that night the Germans threw some mortar shells in. And in a 1 in a million shot, one of those, when you fire artillery, you bracket. You fire if you're short, you go up. If you're over, you split the difference. You call that a bracket. In other words, you say, go up 1,000, and if you're over, then you say, come down 500. And sure enough, they put a mortar shell right in the turret of one of our tanks. There was a man named Blackard in there, and a man named White, Sergeant White, who had been a recruiting sergeant in Detroit and had asked for combat duty. And he came with us, and they were our first casualties. I don't remember Blackard's first name right now, or White's either, but I remember them. I can see them, their faces, just as plain as I could then, but it just made a mess of the whole inside of the turret of that tank. The assistant gunner was badly wounded, but wasn't killed. The driver was badly wounded, but he also was evacuated. The assistant driver or bow gunner just got hit a little bit in the back with some shrapnel, and he had some marks on his back, but his name was Woods. And he came running. That's how we knew this happened. He came running and told us all about it. He was out of his head at the moment. So those were our first casualties. And as the war went on, I came to realize that sometimes seemed like the best guys that got killed, because here this White was only there because he had said he wanted to, be in combat. He didn't want to stay back here recruiting. And so we had these casualties at Bettweiler. The next day, and it was almost Christmas Day, I think it was Christmas Day or Christmas Eve, we were out on the hill, the other side of Bettweiler, and we were set up in what we call hull defilade, so that only the turret of our tank would look over the top of the hill in case we could get something to fire at. And our headquarters tank, that was our battalion commander's tank, and I think the name on that was the Golden Gate in 88 was their name they had on that. And there was a place there where there had been a bonfire or a campfire, and they started a fire, and they were all sitting around this fire, and didn't a German shell land right smack in the middle of that fire. The Germans must have had that zeroed in, because that's one advantage the Germans had on us. They knew every pinpoint in Europe. They had it all mapped out, and it killed 4 of the men in that tank crew, and that was Christmas Eve or Christmas Day, I'm not sure. And that was the beginning of our casualties in the 714th. So as time went on, we just prior to that, the day before, I was on the tank radio when a message came back, and somebody said, Colonel Meigs has met with an accident. And Colonel Meigs was the battalion commander of I think the 43rd Tank Battalion. And he was killed. What the accident he met with was an 88 had taken his head right off. And he was a young, very young lieutenant colonel, West Point graduate. And of course his son was supposed to have been our guest speaker down in Virginia last month. But he was, I think, one of the first casualties we had. But then as far as the C Company, our company went, these ones in Betteville were. So we went on from there, and I'm trying to think where our next, what we maneuvered around. It seemed to me like we weren't doing an awful lot of anything for a few days until one night Captain Clayton went to a meeting. And he came back and he said, we're going to go down by the Rhine River to a place called Herlisheim, and we're going to, there's about 900 Germans down there, and we're going to go down and clean them out. And this was during the Battle of the Bulge, of course. The Battle of the Bulge was to the north of us. And he said, just about 900 Germans down there, we got to go down and clean them out. And they were just sending Combat Command B, which consisted of the 714th Tank Battalion and the 56th Armored Infantry and the 495th Field Artillery. I believe it was 495th. But anyway, we broke into two task force Power and Rammer. And we were Rammer, and we consisted of C Company, B, and A Company of the 714th, and D Company, light tanks, and the C Company of the 56th Armored Infantry Battalion. B Company of the 714th had been assigned to the other task force. So we headed for this town called Herlisheim. And we came to Gambesheim, I think, first, and then a place called Oberhofen. And we left Oberhofen heading down this road. And being the gunner, I'm inside the turret. I really didn't get a good view of the landscape because I've only got a periscope to look out of. But as I visualize it now, I could see the road ahead of us. And we were going down the road, and there was a bridge there across a creek or a stream or a body of water at least. And the engineers were there trying to repair this bridge. The Germans had blown it, and we couldn't get across. So, and these engineers were taking it. You know, the Germans could throw artillery fire or anything in there. But finally they got the bridge fixed, and we got across the first bridge. But then, about down this road that we finally called, Purple Heart Lane or Heartbreak Road, anyway, I've seen the pictures of it since, in fact, down in the museum. We got in this big field between this stream that we had crossed and the Zorn River. And you could see Herlisheim over there, a typical German-type town with the small buildings very close together, and it just looked like a little village. And some of the armored infantry got across into town, and Jimmy Phelps, who was one of our platoon sergeants, took his platoon up by the waterworks, and they were trying to get across, and every time they moved out, but the bridge up there was out too. They couldn't get across that bridge across the Zorn River. And so we were there almost all that day, and toward the afternoon, some Germans started coming across the river to surrender. And I remember getting out. I didn't smoke, and we got a pack of cigarettes every day in our ration. So I got out and I actually gave these Germans some cigarettes. They were surrendering, and I didn't want the cigarettes, so I gave them cigarettes and sent them on back. And they went back, and I thought, well, another one of these deals where we're going to get them surrendering, and there isn't going to be much to it. But toward the afternoon, they started opening up on us with what I heard since were 5-inch guns up in the woods. It might have been 88s, but anyway, they were high-powered cannon, because as we pulled up next to one of the headquarters company tanks right next to us, Captain Clayton was going to tell the lieutenant there how to set up for the night. Boom, that tank got hit, and you could, when a tank got hit and you were near it, you could hear it. It was like popping a bottle of champagne. These 88s would go through them just like butter. And I saw a man come out of the turret of that tank with half his leg gone, and he jumped off, and I'm looking out the periscope. That's all I could see. Well, we started backing away, and you would figure that if they hit them, it would only be a movement of a very small movement to hit us, but they didn't. They didn't get us. And a little while after that, B Company, our B Company, who had been with the other task force, had been gotten over toward Herlisheim. And how it was, they came across in front of us, and as they came across, it was just like a shooting gallery. The Germans picked off about 6 of their tanks, one right after another. And it was getting dark by this time. And we sat there out in that field that night, and you could see those tanks burning. And they burned like a volcano. Every once in a while, the ammunition would explode, and the sparks would go up. And you could smell the human flesh burning, because some of the guys didn't get out of them. And then some of our infantrymen started coming back across the river. They must have swam across the river. And I was out on the ground on guard duty, and some of them came up to me, and of course in the dark you weren't sure who they were, but as it turned out they were some of the infantrymen that had come back. And at the time I didn't know whether these guys had deserted and left or whether they, but they were coming back, and I felt for them too, because I knew what must be going on over there in Herlisheim. And so anyway, they went on back. But the next morning came, and we got organized, and somehow we got across that bridge into Herlisheim. And once again, I'm in the turret. I can't see too much, but I could see bodies in the road and everything. And I don't know how Julian drove our tank down that road without running over some of them, because I could see them. And of course, as we got closer to them, I'd lose sight of them. I don't know what happened, but I still dream about that, those bodies laying there. And some of them were Americans, some of them were Germans. But we got into town, and once we got into town, here you got 18, 20, 25 tanks coming into a small town, and we've only had taken a part of the town, and there was no place to go. We were just piling up, one right behind the other. So we pulled up into a little courtyard outside of one of these houses, and our other headquarters platoon tank, Jerry Roach was the tank commander, pulled up behind us. And Captain Clayton says, Lieutenant Colonel Phelan at that time called a meeting. So Colonel Phelan, who was our battalion commander then, and the company commanders of A Company, C Company, our company, and I don't know whether D Company commander was there or not, but all the ones that were there, and most of the platoon leaders, who were lieutenants, went into this building to hold a meeting. It was obvious now when you think back to it, the Germans could see everything we were doing, because while they're in there, a German come right out the alley right next to us, and with a Panzerfaust, and the Panzerfaust is a thing that looks like a toilet plunger, a big ball with a tube on it. He hit this tank behind us, Jerry Roach's tank. And I was up in the turret of my tank, and I saw it hit. I saw 4 men come out of it and run, and the bow gunner's hatch didn't open. And somebody, one of the engineers I think it was there with a crowbar trying to open that hatch. Well, I knew Bob Blackham. And I left my tank, and I ran over there, and it was starting to burn. It was starting to smoke. But regardless, I went in the driver's hatch, and I reached over there, and I unlatched his latch was locked, and there he was. I could see that he'd been hit in the side of the head. And I boosted him out, and this other man, and I'm not sure who it was, he grabbed him and pulled him out. Well, I took Bob, and I carried him in the building there, and he was thrashing, and he died in my arms. And this was a man who I understood was a vice president of the Standard Oil Company of Ohio before he went into the Army. He went in through the ASTP, and that's how he came to our outfit. He was a private first class, is all he was. That's his rank. He should have probably been an officer. He was a very, very, well-educated, intelligent man, and one of the nicest guys you could ever know.
What was his full name?
Robert Blackham. And he lived in Ohio, state of Ohio. I'm not sure where. I could probably find out. But anyway, Bob was gone. So I went back to my tank, and one of the lieutenants said, then this artillery shell hit the house where the battalion commander had called the meeting. And as it turned out, company commander from A Company was badly wounded. Our battalion commander, Smokey Joe we call him, Colonel Phelan, had, I believe, a broken back. A couple of our lieutenants got hurt. But anyway, so we brought, Captain Clayton came back, and then he was the ranking, able-bodied officer in this task force. So I've heard it mentioned on some of the things that Colonel Boone, and I think they referred to him as Captain Boone too, maybe he was a captain then, but Colonel Boone, who was our executive officer at the time, he wasn't even up front. He was back someplace. Well, regardless, and that was normal because the battalion commander was with us, and the executive officer would be back with the trains or something. But anyway, we loaded Colonel Phelan on the back of a tank, and Bob Blackham's body, and a German prisoner who we had taken, who very well may have been the man who hit this tank. So, and he was wounded too. And we loaded them all in the back of a tank, and Jerry Roach went back on. Now, how he ever got out of there, how he ever went back that road out, I don't know, but he did. He got out with Colonel Phelan on, and Bob Blackham's body, and a German prisoner, and maybe one or other wounded, I don't know. But so anyway, then it was decided we were going to evacuate Herlisheim, get out of there, because we just couldn't they tell me, and I didn't see this personally, but they tell me that our infantry would go out to try to go past 2 or 3 houses, and coming back, the Germans would fall right in line with them and come back with them. That's how confused everything was. And so we decided to get out, and we started out not the way we came in, but as if my sense of direction remembers right, we went straight ahead anyway, down where there was supposed to be another bridge or some way out of there. And our tank either hit a mine, and it blew it off into the canal. And I jumped out of the turret because Captain Clayton was up front trying to get us out of there. And we went right in the canal, turned over in the canal. And I jumped and went through the ice, but in those days we wore combat suits, and that's held me up. It was very buoyant. And Sergeant Kist, who was our assistant gunner then, he fell in, and Jerry Theobald, our bow gunner, who was a big man, he grabbed Sergeant Kist and set him right up on the bank, and he pulled me out too, and we got out of there, and I rode out on the back of another tank. We lost our tank there. And Clayton, like I say, was up ahead and brought us out on foot, and eventually got a Silver Star for that because he was cool under fire. And we got out, and we went back to Oberhofen, this little town called Oberhofen, and it was a French family there. And believe it or not, amongst all this going on, I get back and it was mail from me, a package from my mother. And I opened it in this French house. French or German. They spoke German, but it was Alsace, and so it was a mixture of French and German people. And it was 2 little girls and a little boy there. And I opened this package. There was a little toy in there, and my mother had said, if there's some children over there, you can give this to it. I took it out, and I was going to tell them what it was, and I went like this. I said, all together, the 3 of them said, a yo-yo. It was a yo-yo, you know, and they knew what it was. And in fact, they even had me sing the national anthem for him in that house. And this was just overnight this night we were back. And we had grown men, older than me, actually, not the men who were up there fighting, but the men who were in the rear echelon, like our mechanics and things like that, back there, actually crying because of what was happening to the guys up front, you know, and only half a mile away or less. But anyway, Captain Clayton came to me and he said, they're going to get a new tank for you guys, but I'm going into another tank. You want to go with me? And I didn't want to go, but what was I going to say? I said, yes. So we went. He took a tank commander and a gunner out of another tank, and we got in that tank and we went back up. And it was very questionable. We never got back into Herlisheim after that. Our task force didn't. I guess it was the day or two after that the 43rd and one of the other infantry battalions came from the south and tried to come up there, and that's when all the other confusion where the 43rd really got shellacked real bad. We pulled back toward Gambesheim, and we set up in the woods. And we set up, and by this time some elements, I think, of the 2nd Infantry Division were coming up to support, to kind of relieve us to some extent. Because if we hadn't kept attacking, looking back on it, if the Germans had realized how bad we had been, kind of chewed up, they could have gone right through us. There was nothing between us and Paris because everything had been committed to the Bulge up in the north. The 4th Armored Division and Patton's troops were all up there trying to relieve Bastogne. But we, I guess, kept them busy enough so that they never realized that what a favorable position they were in. But anyway, we set up in this woods that night, and the infantry I don't know what grade, what rank this current infantry officer was with the 2nd Division. I see them setting up their machine guns out there by the book. They set up, they had their field of fires all lined out, and they said, if anybody comes across the field, they told us not to fire, not to disclose that we were there, that they would handle it until they gave us the word that they needed support from us. But later that night, you could hear the Germans coming across the field talking. They're talking like there was nothing going on. And they got just to a certain point, and these infantry troops pulled a string or something, and the flares went up and lit up the whole field, and these machine guns opened up, and they knocked down, I don't know how many Germans, but it must have been 50 of them at least that they knocked down out there in the middle of that field. And then all night long, you could hear these Germans yelling, help me, in English. Whether that was a ruse for us to come out there or not. But anyway, in the morning they did go out with some weapons carriers and pick up some of these Germans that were wounded and bring them back. And this was pretty much our commitment to Herlisheim. We were the initial attack on Herlisheim. After that, the 43rd and I guess 56 was with us. It must have been one of the other infantry battalions really got beat up down there, 17th, I guess it was. And so it wasn't until we got relieved completely. I thought at the time that they might even disband the 12th Armored Division. We were hurt that bad, knowing that the 43rd was pretty near demolished. The 714th wasn't in very good shape. Our company was as good as any. We lost, I think we only lost 3 or 4 tanks in there. But B Company lost 7 or 8 at least. A Company lost some. So we were in kind of tough shape. But we went back. We had a little rest period, and it wasn't much, a week or so after that or so, maybe 2 weeks, we headed down to Colmar to take, and we drove all night one night, all night, blackout, no lights, no nothing, on strange roads and everything. We get down almost to where we're going, and here comes the French First Army up the road with all their lights blaring and everything, and it lit up the whole sky, and that was nothing new, but they were something. So anyway, then we went into, our next combat after that was Colmar. We went into Colmar, and the Germans didn't really even know we were coming. We were in the city when they fell out for reveille in the morning. And we had the village square there surrounded when they fell out. And then we left Colmar, and we went a little farther south, and what was there but another town called Herlisheim, a second Herlisheim, but no combat, it wasn't much. In fact is, and I feel bad about this in a way, because I got to a point and I said, you know, Captain Clayton, I've never fired a shot into Germany. Can I fire a shot into Germany? And he said, yes. And I fired one shot, and now I stop and think about it. I wonder what I hit. You know, if I hit an innocent home or something. But I guess you don't think about those things sometime, but I do now. But there was just one shot, and I'm hoping it didn't hit anything. But then, after that, we were transferred to Patton's 3rd Army. We went up near Trier, and from Trier we started off down through the Saar Mountains, and it was almost like the Adirondack Mountains up where I live in upstate New York. It was beautiful country, beautiful pine trees and mountains. And I remember going up this winding road, and here was one of our tank destroyers. The difference between a tank destroyer and a tank is more heavier armor plated. A tank destroyer in those days had 90mm guns on them instead of 75s or 76s. But apparently the Germans had captured one of our tank destroyers and had set it up there, but it wasn't manned, so we got around that. And we went down toward Spires. Our original objective was Worms, but somebody beat us to it, I guess, got there because Patton had 4 armored divisions abreast at that time going down through there. And we got down, we got hit. We got a tank knocked off, a track knocked off. We had to wait, so Captain Clayton this time got in another tank and went on ahead, and only the 4 of us stayed with the tank. And finally a maintenance crew came along and fixed our track, and off we went, trying to catch up with our own company. And I was driving at the time. That time Julian didn't let me drive, so I'm coming down around a mountain, and here the road, as far as you could see, was nothing but armored vehicles, tanks, half-tracks, scout cars. There was so much a mass of American forces going down. Well, I hit the back end of there was a man out there relieving himself, and I hit the back end of his truck because he just quit. And the tank slid over, and the only thing that kept it from rolling down off the mountain was a big road marker bigger than our memorial sign out here. In Europe, they had these markers all over it to mark, and that we rested right on it. So we had to wait an hour or two after that till a big prime mover came along and put a cable on so we could drive the tank out of there. But anyway, finally we caught up with the company before they got to Spire, where they'd been moved down to go into Spire. And we got there, and we once again, going into Spire, we hit a roadblock. And we normally had C Company, the 56th Armored Infantry, was almost always worked with our task force. And we worked like a real team. Captain Fairborn, who was captain of C-56, was great. His men, he had good NCOs apparently because they seemed to do everything right. But this day we had a different company assigned to us, and they couldn't do a thing. Normally you hit a roadblock, a tank can do one or two things. If you stick your head around the corner and there's an 88 protecting that roadblock, you're going to lose a tank. Or whatever. But so what you do is you send out the infantry, and the infantry with their snipers can knock off these people that are manning that roadblock, and the next thing you know, then you go storming through. But this company that was assigned to us at that time didn't do much of anything. So Clayton put a call back, and soon here comes C Company. They come up there. 15 minutes later, we're passed through the roadblock and on our way down into town. And we pulled into Spire, and Spire's a cathedral town on the Rhine River. I should say a college town, I believe. Anyway, nice city. And we pulled right into the middle of the city, and if you went into a German town like that, if the white flags came out, if the people started putting their white flags out, you felt pretty safe. If you didn't see any white flags, then you thought there might be SS troopers around, and the people were afraid to put their white flags out. But they started, a window opened, and boy, everybody's got their guns pointed up there, and the white flag comes out. So a lady came out, and she said to me, "Where are you from?" I said, "Albany, New York." She said, "Well, I lived in Queens, New York," which is 50 miles from Albany. See? So anyway, it shows what you can run into right in the middle of a war. But then we went on, and we were only about 2 blocks from the bridge. Of course, it was always a constant thing that Colonel Field, who was now our battalion commander, would be back there yelling, "Clayton, we got to take that bridge. We got to take that." Always. Your next objective was always a bridge across some stream or river or something. But anyway, he's yelling about this bridge across the Rhine River, and we got about 2 city blocks from it, and up it went. And I remember Charlie Clayton saying, "Field, there's your bridge." And sure enough. But it was only the next night we crossed the Rhine River on a platoon bridge. And you've probably seen the picture of Patton on the Rhine Bridge, you know. And so we went across into Germany, I think the very next day, crossed into Germany. And from there on, we went on down into almost Austria. I can think of guys that we killed. A man named Neville Johnson, who was in our motor pool, fixing a half-track, fixing a track and a half-track one day. A mortar shell came in and lit, and we lost him. Another one of the best men you could ever know. George Gray, our armorer. Our armorer's duties were to take care, be responsible for inventory and maintenance of all the armament in the company. Not only the guns and the tanks, but the individual sidearms and of the members of the company. And here was George Gray from Texas too. Anytime we lost a tank commander, which happened quite often, he'd be right on the radio. "Can I come up? Can I come up and replace him for you?" And he would. He'd come up. Well, one day we went through a big woods, and the Germans had a roadblock up. Well, we smashed through the roadblock with our tanks, with our point. We went through, no problem. In fact, the Germans deserted it. But apparently, as soon as we got through, they came back and they set the roadblock up again, because when our trains came along, meaning the kitchen truck, the ammo trucks, the gasoline trucks, and things like that, they ambushed them, and George Gray got killed. He was manning a 50 caliber machine gun on one of the trucks, and he got shot by a sniper through the head. That was George Gray. Another man, Lieutenant Landau, was our motor officer. His primary function was to be with the train. He was the executive officer for the company, first lieutenant next to the captain, and he was with us right from basic training. And Harold Landau was another one. Every time that we lost a lieutenant, a platoon leader, Harold Landau would be on the radio. "Can I come up? Can I?" And he would. We'd bring him up. Well, he came up one day, and he took over one of the tanks, one of the platoons, and sure enough, he got hit, and he got Well, a man named Ira Yates, who comes to most of our reunions, wasn't here this year, but Ira's been to most of the reunions for the last 15 years, saved his life by putting a pressure point on because Harold would have bled to death from wounds in his neck. And I didn't see Harold after that. After they evacuated him, I didn't see him until our first reunion in 1947 in New York City. He came in a wheelchair. His wife was with him. And, you know, one of the things that happened, after this deal in Herlesheim, I was awarded the Bronze Star for the fact that I went in and got Bob Blackman's body out of this tank. And then they came to me and they said, we can send one man to Paris for a day. Here I am, what, 18, 19 years old, 19 or 20 maybe by then. And I said, I don't want to go unless the rest of my tank crew's going, you know. But Harold Landau came to me, he said, you're going. And he says, I said, well, I don't have any money. Well, he handed me the equivalent of $150, which was a lot of money in those days. And he said, you're going. So I did. I went back. They put me in a GI truck. Back to Paris we went. And you had 24 hours in Paris. From the time you got there, you could have 24 hours. And then you had it back. And so I went on. I took a bath in a bathtub. And I laid down on the bed and I slept for 20 hours, I guess, you know. And anyway, make a long story short, all I had time to do was I bought a gift for Harold Landau to send to his wife, some French perfume, and a silk scarf for Captain Clayton for his, I figured he'd want to send something to his wife. And so when I went back, I gave Captain Clayton this silk scarf, and I remember Harold Landau, Lieutenant Landau saying, did you get anything from me? I said, I sure did. And you know, when I met them in New York City, he said, this is the man that bought that perfume for you, you know, and it was a reward then. And but Harold died, now must be 20 years ago now. He never did walk again after that accident. But there was another man who was doing a little more than his duty, quite a bit more. And it seemed that that's the way the war was. The guys that really were out there, you know, always willing to do more were some of the guys that really got the worst of it. I could name others, I'm sure, but I think of Harold. Now, Charlie Clayton, our company commander, I've never seen him at a reunion. I understand he was at one reunion in Denver that I missed. And we were so close. I remember we used to curl up in the tank on the cold nights to keep each other warm. Here I was a corporal, he was a captain. Well, you know, didn't make much difference right then. And I called him one day and I said, you know, he said, well, you know, I'm retired now. And he says, I not only was company commander of C Company 714 Tank Battalion, but he retired as a colonel. And he said, I've commanded brigades and I've been deputy commanders for divisions and everything. He said, I've been active in so many things. And he says, right now my whole life is golf. He says, that's all I do is play golf. So then Lieutenant Colonel Field, who was our battalion commander, stopped in to visit me one day at home because we became pretty close over the years at the reunions. And you wouldn't know that he'd been the commander, the battalion commander, and I was a corporal because we were family, just like most of us Hellcats are. And so he stopped at my house one day. He was touring up through New England, and he lived down in Atlanta, Georgia. And he stopped, and we had a nice visit, and he went home, and he went to the Holocaust. When they opened the Holocaust Museum in Washington, he fell, and he went to the hospital, and he never got out. His wife called me at 11 o'clock one night. Ruth called, and she said, Fred's gone. And I didn't even know that he'd had that accident. And so I sat up all that night, and I wrote a memorial for Fred Field, and I mailed it to the undertaker where he was going to be. And they did get it, and I understand that he was buried in Arlington Cemetery. And they used my memorial. The Army chaplain used that because, of course, I knew Fred better than he did. And that's what he said. He said this was better. And I just traced, you know, from the time I knew him after he took command of our battalion at Herlesheim. And I remember one time he chewed me out pretty bad for riding a German motorcycle in one of the towns we took. And he told Captain Clayton, he said, this man's got to be disciplined, and I mean disciplined. And he walked away, and Captain Clayton looked at me and he said, you heard that, didn't you? He says, well, you've been disciplined. But, you know, and I told Fred Field about that years later. He said, well, you know, I had to do those things. I said, I understand. I'm not complaining. But Fred and I became real good friends, you know, and family again. And so Fred is in Arlington, and Captain Clayton, they called Captain Clayton's home to see if he could be at Fred's funeral. And they said, Captain Clayton was buried in Arlington 2 weeks ago. He had passed away 2 weeks before, and he's in Arlington. And in fact, as I've got home now, pictures of their gravestones in Arlington from when we were down there 2 weeks ago, and good snapshots of their gravestones. And so we had good officers, and we had good NCOs, and I would say that 99% of the men in the 714th Tank Battalion were just damn good Americans, you know. They were great. And that's the reason I'm proud to be a Hellcat, and that's the reason my son, I have a son who, when he was in high school, he came to me one day, he said, "Dad, I'm joining the Army." I said, "Why?" He said, "Well, you were in the Army, and you seemed to like it." And he says, "If I join the Army now, I get a $25,000 bonus to go to college." And so I said, "Well, that's up to you if you want to go." Well, he graduated in June, and middle of July, he went off in the Army, and he went to, well, first they sent him, he wanted to get into engineering and refrigeration and air conditioning and things like that. They sent him to Fort Belvoir for only a month, and then they sent him down to Fort Benning. He had to make his parachute jumps. And he called me one day, he said, "I haven't jumped yet, Dad." He said, "I got to make 5 jumps before I finish here." So he called me 2 days later, he said, "I did it." I said, "You jumped?" He said, "I jumped 5 times. They jumped them 3 times one day and twice the next day to get them through because they were late on account of the weather. But then Todd got married, and he married a girl down in North Carolina, so he never came home after being in high school. He's down in North Carolina now, got 2 children, doing great, although his job is kind of questionable. The company he works for, they're not doing all that great, but Todd seems to be getting along good. But the point is, I was glad to see him go in the Army, and he got out. Just as glad to see him get out. But then they called him back when the Persian Gulf came along. They needed somebody to set up a field hospital, and that's what his specialty was. This group that he was with could jump in and set up a field hospital in 90 minutes and have an operating room more sterile than most hospitals you have, because it was a package that they would inflate. And he went over and they set up a hospital over in Saudi Arabia. When he came home from there, he said, "Dad, we came home too early." He said, "When we left, 90% of the people in our hospital were Iraqi civilians who needed help." And he says, "But still we came home too early, even though he wanted to come home." And as it works out, I guess we did. But then again, that's water over the dam. But today, I'll be perfectly honest, my feelings aren't exactly the same they were today that they were when we went in the service or when my son went in, because I just see things happening in this country. We've lost so many of those things that we fought for. You know, so many of the integrity, the morality of some of the people in this country today is such that maybe I'm not quite just as patriotic as I was 50 years ago, because it bothers me to see some of the things that are going on. But I hope it changes. I certainly wouldn't want my son, if the time came, to not do his duty for his country, but I would like that when he does do it, that he's doing it for something he believes in and something that he really wants. I guess that's the way I feel. I feel that about this Hellcat Association. For a long time I felt bad because not many people from C Company came to the reunions. And then it got to where I started getting some of the C Company people coming. See, I was president in 1971, 25 years ago. And if you read the Hellcat News next month, you'll see an article that was written up in Milwaukee 25 years ago about these old men from World War II. And that's 25 years ago. I don't feel like an old man now. And I still working 40 hours a week. And so I reprinted that in my next column that will come out in November. And then I said on the bottom of it, I said, "I wonder what this reporter's doing today," you know. He was just a young kid. But I just would hope that this country is always as worth fighting for as it was when we went and fought for it. That it just gets back to what it was. Because I feel that it's gone downhill some in the last 20 years. And my hope is that we can straighten some of these things out and really rebuild our pride in our country. And that's the reason I want to talk. I want to talk about guys like Jimmy Phelps, who's now home in Kentucky and got Parkinson's disease. He loves to play golf. He loves to come to reunions, but he hasn't been able to the last year now because his leg was partially paralyzed. Then we got a man named Frank Scaglione, who was a platoon sergeant in C Company. And toward the end of the war, he became first sergeant because our first sergeant got a battlefield commission and went to D Company. But Frank Scaglione had a heart attack last spring out in Dunkirk, New York, and now his wife Annie had a heart attack just this last week. And I keep in touch with them. And these people, well, they were sergeants, I was only a corporal. They were married and I wasn't. We didn't have all that much in common in the service, although we were together, because like I wrote a thing for Frank Scaglione's 50th wedding anniversary. I said, sergeants went around in different circles than corporals did. But still, today, we're family. We're just as close as my own brothers and sisters are. And I've come to love every one of them very much. And not only 714th, but the 56th, any of them. They go downstairs here, and there's hardly a soul down there. Of course, here in the Southwest now, I see people that I don't see at all the national reunions. When you go to one up in the Northeast or the Eastern or the National, I know most of the people, more of them know me than I know because I've been a unit rep, and so therefore my name's a little more familiar. But I just find that it's just one big, great family, this group of Hellcats. And I think fighting for our country had something to do with it. But I just feel that the type of man that they took into the service in 1942 and put in the 12th Armored Division were something special. And I don't feel the least bit shy about saying that. And I'm just proud to be one of them. I guess that's my story.
Welcome to Channel 17, the Town of Colonie Government Channel.